we are going to show you that the regional flare-ups, minor trade wars, and other issues that are caused by the tensions around Taiwan are going to be solved on our side of the motion, bringing massive benefits to China, Taiwan, the US, and other regional actors in these areas. Before we do that, a couple of points of A, framing, and B, saying why full-scale invasion is just extremely unlikely on either side of the house. A, what we're doing in this debate is debating granting Taiwan full membership of NATO, which means they enjoy Article 5, so if they're invaded, they can request the full power of NATO to back them up. Second, it's non-conditional, so they're just added, and then we're granting it. This means the motion assumes Taiwan joins NATO, and there's no question of what Taiwan is going to do about the decision to join. They have joined NATO. Let's understand why a full-scale invasion is extremely unlikely. First of all, Taiwan just has terrible geography for invading. It has cliffs on one side and very shallow beaches on the other side, which you have to land very far away in order to actually get there. But secondly, even without Taiwan's terrible geography, it's incredibly difficult to mount a naval invasion of anywhere, because you have to leave your ships vulnerable with your troops on a very large distance across the sea, which is clearly visible for satellites, which is very vulnerable to attacks because there's no other troop ships, right? They're not warships. They're vulnerable to any missile from Taiwan. They are very easy to maneuver to. They're very easy to react to for other forces in other countries. But secondly, it's very easy to be prepared for it in advance because it's very visible when you're preparing to make a naval invasion, right? You can bring your troops secretly, you can bring the troops quickly, you have to amass the ships required in order to do so. But I think on a third level, they have a fear of significant trade war because what they've learned from the Russia invasion of Ukraine is that there is likely to be sanctions from the West, and China is in a bad economic situation, right? They have a housing bubble that is collapsing, is causing their economy to be in bad situation. They have high growth unemployment, causing them economic problems. They have not recovered well from the corona crisis. All of this means that they are trying to de-escalate the trade war. We can see it by them not reacting to the CHIPS Act by the US against China, as them not wanting to create a trade war. They would not want to risk the retaliation by sanctions even, or worse, US involvement in order to do a full invasion. So I think a full invasion is just extraordinarily unlikely. Let's understand what we mean when we say those flare-ups, just to be very clear. We've had cases of US airplanes and Chinese airplanes coming so close to each other that one of them had to admit an emergency evacuation because they nearly collapsed. We had ships from the US and China passing near to each other that they had to disarm because they were that close to collapsing. We had Taiwanese planes doing crash landings and we had them going up quickly. But more than all those tensions, but are also in the South China Sea, where China is contesting multiple countries' territorial claims and is actually acting against Indonesia and other countries by trying to force their navy, or what they call the Coast Guard, to claim these territories, is causing trade wars to follow it up. Because when those countries don't recognize China's claim, China tries to pressure them, and they react by limiting trade, otherwise hurting individual citizens and members of this country by significantly pushing up the price of basic goods like food and fuel and other imports, but also manufactured goods, and also creating a massive sense of insecurity. Because the fact that Chinese invasion of Taiwan is extremely unlikely, the feeling that Chinese ships might come into firefight with an Indonesian ship in the middle of the ocean just makes you very insecure about the future of what's going to happen to you. Why does joining NATO uniquely change this? We think when you add Taiwan to NATO, unlike current security guarantees Taiwan gets from the US, you are giving them access to the NATO agreement. And the NATO agreement has much more weight in international perception than any individual agreement can be, because if the US does not honor it, if the NATO members do not fully honor it, it does not only question this, put this element into question, it means that all the other big countries guaranteed by this alliance can no longer fully trust it. Therefore, the price of not fully guaranteeing the alliance, of not fully following through its articles, is incredibly high for all these member countries. That means it is going to be impossible for any of those member countries to resist and say, no, we're actually not going to come into the defense of Taiwan. It's going to be impossible for them not to come and help them under any circumstances, which means the fact that there is now an explicit security guarantee, which is much more nuanced, much more strong than any other guarantee that can be given, is massively changing the conversation. We think it changes the conversation on the first level, on the US and the regional allies, because it gives a unique commitment by the US to countries in the region which are not the traditional allies. It's not just Japan and South Korea that have US military bases in them. It's not saying the US is willing to stand up to China on issues China cares about massively. It's willing to stand up, yes, we don't care, we don't believe your threats, we don't believe the final Chinese warning, we are willing to stand up to countries in this region. And as a US ally, this is massively important news for you, because it means you can stand up for your territorial claims. It means you can defend your territory, knowing that you are not going to be subjected to massive Chinese sanctions because the US is likely to back you, knowing that you are not going to be under massive Chinese action against you in the sea, because you think there is a very good chance the US will be willing to back you because they're more willing to stand up to China on this issue, which is the most important one to China. The US is willing to stand up on this issue, they are very willing to stand up on other issues. But on the second level, we think this significantly changes Taiwan's behavior. Because I think right now, Taiwan has an inherent sense of insecurity. Despite that the invasion is extremely unlikely, when a massive country like China threatens you with invasion, you are inevitably worried about it. This means that whenever a Chinese plane flies nearby, Taiwan sends up a plane to intercept it, right? You create opportunities for flare-ups and risks by Taiwanese actions because they are trying to protect themselves from China. Now that they have the full security guarantee of the US, of NATO, they are not going to have to do that, right? They can afford to be more lax. They can afford not to contest Chinese movements because they know that China is not able to do anything to them. China is not putting them in any risk. But more than, I don't think Taiwan is going to start being randomly aggressive towards China because they have a massive trade relation with China, which is super important to them, and risking it in order to do foolish, aggressive actions, especially when half of Taiwanese vote to support a closer relationship with China, is just extremely unlikely. Before I continue, second?
Okay. Do you have any reason at all to stand up specifically for Taiwan? There is a lot of country in risk around the world.
I think if there are possibly other countries you can add to NATO, we don't object to that. We don't think there is a problem with adding other countries. Let's understand how it's going to change Chinese behavior. Because I think China is much less likely to take aggressive actions compared to Taiwan under those circumstances because they know that the threat of invasion is now not a realistic threat. They cannot believe this is actually going to work because they're not actually going to risk a war with the United States, a war with NATO, or any massive escalation. So they're not going to threaten it anymore. They're not going to push this anymore. They're not going to try and isolate Taiwan to nearly the same extent because there is no purpose to it. They know that the pressure has failed and the pressure is not achieving anything. We think on a second level, while China might react angrily in the short run, in the long run, it's going to create less tension with the United States. Because now the United States has a clear position on Taiwan, unlike now when the United States, yes, one country, two countries, one country, two systems, we're not sure what our position is. US now supports Taiwan independence explicitly, meaning that when Nancy Pelosi or another US politician goes to visit Taiwan, China has no point in getting angry because this is just the US position. There is now clarity, so even if we have flare-up now, we're not going to have massive flare-ups in the future. But for all of them told, China does not want a trade war right now, and therefore their ability to actually take significant action against the US and against NATO is very limited, so I don't think they're going to see significant actions from them. For all those reasons, please propose.
3, 2, The Prime Minister analyzed quite fully why we are giving China the massive middle finger by doing this, why we are telling China that we do not support them, we do not believe they have any control over us, any power of us, we as America are going to do whatever the fuck we want, we're as NATO, and you guys can't do jack shit about it. Essentially, you are riling up a megalomaniac country that cares a lot about its pride, a lot about its standing in the world, a lot about other people respecting the great Republic of China and everything it stands for, taking away all their power and saying, yes, sit on your hands because you want to trade with us. It is not practical for who China is, it's not on the point, and we will get into that analysis, but I appreciate your analysis helping us. Now, what are China's interests? China has obviously interests in economic interest, as everyone in this room agrees, or at least opening government. But they also have other interests. They have interest in having power over their citizens, and their citizens having idealization belief in them. And they have interest in having power in the IR level, as in other people respecting out of fear who they are and what they stand for and how much they can influence. What is happening right now in Taiwan? Opening government is also talking about how China doesn't want to piss off the West, and they're staying neutral on some level, and they're staying good with the West, and they're not, they're trying to stay on good terms with the West. They're beating the crux of the matter that we are taking away their incentive to stay good with the West. What does that actually mean? It means right now China believes it has a claim for Taiwan and all these other countries that, well, you mentioned, who knows IL better than me. But now, what does that actually mean that they have an interest in these countries? They know that the Western world is semi-working against it, but they also know that they have a level of compromise that they have to do with the Western world. As in, we are going to not boycott Russia completely, but unlike America and all these other countries who are sending active shit to help Ukraine, we're not going to actively put our placement down that we're actively helping Russia because that puts us on the wrong side of the West. And we need them to agree with us in other things. They care the most about taking back what's theirs. They care the most about taking back Taiwan that belongs to them, or Indonesia, or all these other countries. I appreciate that. But all these different things, this is what is integrally important to them, and they believe that they have to compromise with the West in order to get it done. What happens when we take away the need for compromise, which is what opening government is suggesting, essentially? You're saying, we don't believe that China has any power, we're going to put them under the protection of NATO as a standby, okay, any of these other countries can join our NATO, and we're essentially telling China that they can't have it. What is this actually doing, okay? Right now, China initially invested in Russia for the war. Okay, they put in their interest heavily. They supported them not in terms of, like I said, active troops or whatever. They kept the level of neutrality to be with the West, but they had some level of support in their minds for Putin. They were not boycotting Putin the way the rest of the country was, the rest of the world was. What is actually happening? No, over the course of the last year, it has become, or 6 months even, it's become more clear how much the situation in Russia is destabilizing, how much Putin is not continuing to hold his power, how this Russian-Ukraine conflict is probably not going to end with Russia as the amazing victors the way people originally assumed would happen. Right now, the West has made it really careful that China feels neutral in terms of that so that they still have some need to listen to the West. What happens when we're taking Taiwan away? By taking Taiwan, or adding Taiwan to NATO, we're essentially saying, it's not yours, China, fuck you. I think we can all agree that that is actually what's happening. We're taking it away from China. What you're doing is you are slapping them in the face. You are saying, we are taking this away from you. We are taking away all incentives for you to be in any way interested in appeasing us. What does this give us an incentive now? Okay, right? The second that NATO is directly opposing them, well, not now. The second NATO is directly opposing them, they are taking, they have to now think about what other outsources and what other resources they can use. As in, there are three main superpowers, America, China, Russia, there's also the EU that goes with NATO, all of us know this, and these three tend to be in a relatively stagnant position of we all fighting for the superpower. It is also very clear, though, that Russia and China are less of the Western world, and America falls more under the category of the Western world and where it stands. As in, they're in a direct conflict, but when the Western world is making such a clear, we don't support you, we are never going to help you, you're now giving China a long-term invested interest in Russia's success. You are making it that they integrally want Russia to survive. They want Russia to be another superpower, and they want Russia to be able to join on their bandwagon of harassing NATO, harassing the EU, and harassing the United States. They are playing the long game right now. They are not considering the small little conflict or how much it's going to cost. They're thinking about the fact that America essentially, or NATO took away all of their power, their soft power or hard power, however you want to confuse it. They are challenging them, are you going to invade or not invade if we have NATO respond to you? And they now need to look for other resources and allies, which what does this mean in actual impact, okay? If you want to help Russia, and if they want to help Russia, they have sheer ability to. They can send a shitload of money, they can send troops, they can send weapons. What does all these things do besides actually adding to the resources of the war? It also is giving an extra oomph to all the people fighting in the war. What does that actual oomph mean, as I would analyze that? It means that you are making it that all the people who now, most people in Russia, most soldiers, they feel like the war is failing. The second they have a major superpower backing them, it gives more hope. It makes it that more people actually believe that they can succeed in the war, which gives them an extra effort in the strength that they are going to do. I will take you at 5:45. It gives them an extra effort of what they're going to do in the war. It gives them more hope on this. It makes it less likely to have a chance of a rebellion or what happened with the whole Wagner situation, as in you know that you now, it's not just Russia, not just Putin who stands. They have this major backing from another major country who currently hates the West into little pieces and wants to do whatever they can to spite them. Sorry, probably should have said this in the beginning of the speech. Itay is going to talk about how it actually increases the chances of a conflict, not necessarily all-out war, as OG wants to do, but the more minor conflicts, the more invasion of all that shit that happens to Taiwan. Okay, now, what do we actually have, what do we actually have right now? Yes, sure.
China has many other more important incentives like economic benefits and political stability it gets from the US and Europe than Taiwan, which they had no control of for the last 70 years, and Ukraine, which they don't care about at all.
China has a lot of interests, okay? Yes, economic interest is one of them, but also, as much as we might want to, is in terms of assuming they're bad people, the EU and NATO cannot trade functionally cut off China, okay? They will not survive economically. They rely on them for enough fucking shit in their day-to-day lives that most economic stability will crash in most countries if we were actually to boycott China immediately. The part that China is actually fighting for, and the part that makes China keep whatever level of neutrality that the NATO wants, is the fact that they believe they have some sort of political leverage and power by listening to the West. By taking away their political leverage and by taking away their power, and essentially you analyze why they now know that China has no power. He specifically analyzed why by doing this you are telling all the other countries that they are safe from China, that China can't actually bully them, and all these things. You are also telling China the same exact thing. You are putting a not super functional dictatorship under the criteria of prove that you actually can fill in your actions. You now have to do actions to threaten. This is a country that cares less about its citizens than average countries in the West. This is a country that is okay with collateral damage, that is okay with the temporary loss of financial gain if it knows that the rest of the world will stop interfering in what does give them financial gain, like the chips in Taiwan. Itay will continue because obviously there's a lot more to be said.
In 3, 2, three main parts to my speech. First of all, I'm going to rebut what we heard from the first house. Secondly, I'm going to increase a few of the mechanisms that we had from our point. Three, I'm going to take extension from second house. Please prepare your extension. We want to hear it in order to have the ability to engage. So, look, what OO tried to explain to us is this. If we're going to do a middle thing in China, now China is going to be angered. It's going to do those like drastic acts. Oh my God, this is going to be awful. Notice that one, we don't understand to what end. If what OO tried to explain is that China is going to do this because now they care so much about Taiwan and they want to pressure the US and stuff like that. Notice that Roi's analysis exactly explains why it is completely unlikely that after NATO already accepted Taiwan as in membership, it will be able that China will be able to pressure US in this way. Meaning that after we accept Taiwan as a member of NATO, you actually don't have any end to those kind of pressure. Meaning you take exactly that incentive from China. But secondly, notice that they actually agree that China has a trade incentive, an economic incentive to continue to trade with the US and Europe, two of the biggest markets in the entire world. So now they want us to believe that China, instead of continuing those economic trades with Europe and the US, are going to now, one, compromise their relations with those countries, and now attack Ukraine. And now attack Ukraine and support Russia. Notice, this is completely absurd, because as they already analyze, Russia is a crumbling economy, a really weak economy that cannot actually be a friend of China. And secondly, because the sanctions that the Europeans and the US are going to can do on China don't have to be extreme. They don't have to okay, now we do the same thing we do to Russia to you. They can just say, oh, we're going to do this small sanction, these specific places, in order for you to stop trading with China. And this is specifically important because we already analyzed to you why China is in a complete economic crisis, a complete political crisis, and they already analyze why they have to maintain their position according to their citizens, right? Meaning that what they try to explain is that China is going to do things that are completely against their own interest, own trade interest, going to anger all the people who are actually able to impose those economic sanctions, and all of that for an end that does not even exist. Three, we think that China just doesn't care about Ukraine and Russia, right? They have just so much bigger problems. They don't have to spend now a huge percent of their budget to help a country that is not going to even win this war because Russia is already getting far behind Ukraine, that is supported by the entirety of Europe and by the entirety of the US. Meaning that even if they do support Russia in this war, they're not going to get anything from it. On the other hand, they're going to spend a huge amount of budget that instead they could have spent on their economy, on their citizens, and making them happy. Also, they're going to anger the citizens. They're not going to say, wait, why are we spending all this money on a weird country on the other side of the world instead of actually fixing the real economic problem we are now suffering, the housing crisis, the crisis in the agricultural crisis, and other crises China has to face. So let's add a few things to what we already explained to you. So first of all, they explain to you what are the impacts of tension. But notice the impacts of tension are not only the direct impacts of tension. You also have secondary impacts, meaning that if you have tension, this heightens extremely the prices of things in Taiwan and hurts the population of Taiwan extremely. Why? First of all, because they now have to spend a lot on defense budget. All countries around China, when you have tension, have to spend so much more money on their defense budget, meaning they have so much less money they have to, one, take a lot more taxes from their citizens, two, have much less money to spend on the citizens, meaning that all their citizens are now suffering much more higher cost in their day-to-day life, meaning you also get that day-to-day life impact. Secondly, we just think that this is going to make investors afraid of spending in those kinds of countries. Meaning that an investor that knows that it is possible that China is going to invade Taiwan is going to be afraid from investing there from the fear of losing all of his money. Meaning that, again, you get much less investment, you get much less day-to-day life good things for the citizens of Taiwan and all other countries in the East China Sea. Meaning you create a secondary amount of impacts. So before I move on, extension.
Yes, I understand you believe that war is possible but not necessarily around the corner. But I don't still understand why would you choose Taiwan over China?
Okay, again, China has different interests that align them against the US, meaning that you cannot just support China, now China is going to be happy and going to be friends with the US. This is because, again, China wants dominance in like the economic war with the US. They want dominance over these parts of East, influence over like North Korea and other enemies of the US, meaning this is just unlikely. Secondly, if you're talking about different countries, they're not China, we just think we don't have to support nor ignore it. You can this is not mutually exclusive with what we suggest. Now let's weigh our points over one, war, secondly, temporary tensions that OG tried to explain. One, we think that what we are explaining is much more likely because it's much more direct from the motion, meaning the moment that we enter Taiwan into NATO, this is exactly the moment when this message is sent. On the other hand, the tension that they are doing is going to be is reliant on the incentives of China changing in a way that allows war or allows tension in the short term, meaning that we are just much more likely. Secondly, we just think this is logically precedent because the tension itself in the region are what determines the likelihood of war. And on the other hand, it does not work. Meaning that if we show you more peaceful area around China, if you show you less tensions around China and US relationship, this means we also show you a less ability, the less chance of war, meaning that we are logically precedent to OO's case. Three, we just think that if you sum the chance of the harm times the amount of people you are affecting times the harm, even if they show a bigger harm in the short term, if we show you that one, again, this is less likely, and two, that it affects much more people, not only China and Taiwan, but all other countries in the region and all other US allies, this means that on the end we reach a much bigger impact on the whole. And yeah, we also just think that this affects much more people. Again, this affects them in their daily life. It affects them in the long term. Why? Because again, if we shorten tensions, it does not affect only the chance of war now. It affects the region to for a long years. Meaning that for long years you get much better economic situation, much better peace, much better life for the citizens. And this is why you should propose.
Everything OG tells us about China is that they can't do it. They can't risk the conflict with the West. They can't do anything anymore. They're just on their knees. They can't actually take any action because then the West will crush them and bind them and they will not be remaining. In my speech, I'm going to explain to you exactly what China is thinking right now. China is thinking. What are the Chinese interests? Why it is likely that the counter-reaction of China would be big, violent, how it weighs against government in this debate, and I'd love to take an extension from opposition, right? Okay. Do we start with engagement? No. We start straight with the analysis. What do we know about China, right? Firstly, China is a proud nation, historically, right? It has the perception of an empire. They are a strong country. They're a proud country. Citizens in China love China. They believe China to be a strong country, and they're educated for that from the beginning of their lives. Secondly, note that China cannot actually accept defeat. China cannot resign to the West at any point, right? This is why historically every escalation was responded with an escalation, right? The trade wars against Trump were just escalated when China got in, when they responded. Every getting close to South Korea from the US, China got closer to North Korea. The escalation just got harder because China cannot show defeat, because it is proud, because it needs to be strong. Thirdly, in a more geopolitical level, China wants to be perceived as a strong, stable ally for Africa, right? For the other not developed nations yet, developing nations, right? It's playing the long game for the places in the world that would, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, would be the most developing, as in with the most profit in them, as in with the most ground for investment in them, as in where you can get more money with them, as in with the more labor, right? Because the West is in problem of labor, because India is almost in a problem of labor, because China is almost in the problem of labor. Their pyramid is like it's going to be like this. We think that the place that there is going to be future labor is Africa. And China wants to swoop in and be perceived as the most stable ally. As in, if China today falls in front of the West, they just cannot actually be perceived as stable, as strong enough to protect from American sanctions or stuff like that. They're perceived as... But fourthly, a fourth reason why we think China would actually affect severely impact. We think Xi Jinping wants a legacy. He's old. He has bad economy today. People are not happy with him. He wants a legacy, and the time is playing against him. His peaceful thought was not a success. He now is not in his prime, and he has to act right now to actually get some legacy, to be remembered as a great leader. We think this means he'll risk a conflict with the West because he needs this legacy, because he wants to be perceived as a strong leader and be remembered through the ages as a good leader of China. These four reasons are the reasons we think China would react and have to act when this action is against them. Every provocation, every provoking action from the West would be answered by China, right? Let's take Xi. Later. Then, what do they say to us? They'll say to us, firstly, the West would buy in China. They're in a bad economical state. Surprise, the West is also in a bad economical state. The whole world is in a bad economical state post-COVID. The West is in, the US is in inflation. The war in Ukraine drains the West's resources. We think the whole world is in a bad economical state, kind of symmetrically, as in we don't think, because the West put the money in Ukraine. We think that the West itself cannot afford to have a trade war more than China can afford. It's kind of symmetrical in that way that no one of them could actually get it. But not like China, we think that the West is prone to the citizens, right? It is prone to pressure from the democratic voters in the countries. As in, if the West is being bad to its citizens, if it's taking money and putting it in places the citizens don't want, if there is a war in China, in Taiwan, or more money is going to Ukraine, the West is going to be not happy with that. As in, we think they can be less persistent in that war, while Chinese citizens who do perceive their nation as proud would actually be able to go through these hardships. Not you, I want an extension.
Yes, we will show you why currently there's a much bigger chance of escalation than after...
Okay, let's talk about that, because I agree escalation is an important clash in this debate, despite OG wanting to take it out. We think, okay, but firstly let's weigh Russia, right? We think they're saying to us, China wouldn't go for Russia because Russia is crumbling. First of all, Russia is not that crumbling. They still have resources, they still have gas, they're still holding up this war. Yes, they're not the strongest, yes, they're not in their peak, but they are existent. And we think that with a strong ally like China, they can prolong this war much more, maybe win it. More Russians dead, more Ukrainian dead, more money and resources drained from the West and the citizens of the West that OG cares so much about. We think it's also a support for Putin if he's able to recruit a significant ally like China. No, I'm not taking you. We think this is also the most important clash in this debate. Why? Because this is where weapons are already firing. We think we don't need a likelihood of clash here or there or there. We think just pumping money into this conflict would prolong it, and you don't need a trigger or to pass some binary threshold for the damage to be done there. It's scalable, thus much more likely to happen. But let's talk about invasion in half a minute. Because OG tells you naval invasion is unlikely, full-on attack is unlikely because it's vulnerable and because it's visible. What do we think is likely? Dropping. We think you can have half blockade. Full blockade for 2 days. You can sink one Taiwanese ship by mistake. We think because the severity of Article 5, NATO wouldn't actually invoke it for those small things. They can't actually invoke it for those provocations. We think today, when China is doing something, US does something back, it's like a delicate dance of that. But we think at the point that Taiwan is actually able to invoke Article 5 and pushing for it to the West wouldn't be able to help it, because if they help it, they have to come full force. And no one wants this war. Not the West, no China, none of them want China wants this war to some extent, but we think the West really can't afford it. We think China's, okay, oppose.
3, 2, 1. Look, first government mainly talked about why the threat of war will be lifted and how that is going to help, and talked about why the fact that full-scale invasion isn't likely. We agree that full invasion isn't likely, but we do think that things on a bigger scale than what they actually talked about, things that are attacks that can actually kill thousands of people, military operations that aren't full-scale war are likely. We're going to show you why that aspect, which is huge human loss and which is the most important thing in this debate, is way more likely if NATO doesn't, if Taiwan doesn't join NATO, even if it is not the most likely scenario because we're talking about such a huge loss. If it's less likely on our side, we win anyways. Before I get to my point, which is exactly that, why a war, even if not full-scale invasion, is more likely without NATO, I'm going to do a few points of rebuttal. So, we hear that the reaction, if NATO does say yes to Taiwan, the reaction from China will be a lot of violence because of a couple of reasons, right? Because of Africa, because we need to appear strong in front of the West, all of those things. I want the panel to notice that all of those reasons stand in the status quo. Actually, I'm going to give a few more reasons, right? But right now, China does not look good in front of the West, in front of the US, and does not look good in front of its own people or Africa, right? For example, the US just really escalated its sanctions if we're talking about the fact that it's not allowing people from the tech industry to actually work in China and thus really limiting it. We're talking about the fact that people from the US government literally came to Taiwan in the middle of an escalation. Right now, that situation that China feels like it has to stand for itself, it's already happening, right? The main delta, because China already feels like it's humiliated by the West, it already feels like they have to act upon all of the reasons we already got. The only actual delta is whether there is good deterrence against doing it. And there is only good deterrence against actually acting upon those incentives when we have NATO. I will get to exactly why NATO will definitely deter China in my speech. So, why war is more likely without NATO? Okay, so we're talking about a war that is not a full-fledged attempt to take over Taiwan, right? But we do know that China is a huge country, that it can bomb Taiwan pretty easily without really risking her own ships from far away. We know that that the country can cause real damage to Taiwan if it only wanted to, and if we're talking about only a few thousands of civilians. Why we think that without NATO this will happen? First of all, Ukraine and Russia actually give a really good example of the fact that invading a different country or attacking its sovereignty isn't that big of a deal. When Russia invaded, even though it is literally in Europe and close to all the Western countries, still we sent only help in the form of weapons. We did not send any troops, there were no nukes, there was no actual big military reaction. In the term of sanctions, yes, Russia received different sanctions, but even for Russia, they didn't really have a big effect because it has gas as a bargaining card, when China knows that it has pretty much the whole production chain as a bargaining card that it can hold against the US and the West, and it can't. China knows they can't actually be sanctioned by the West because they will just collapse economically. Second reason why China has a really big incentive to actually attack. As we already heard, China is failing, right? If we're talking about demographic problems, the fact that their economy is failing, bubbles that are bursting, if we're talking again about specifically right now the US sanctions on technology that are leaving it without any actual chance of catching up because they have no way to access those resources and actually making chips or advanced technology. And when we're talking about so many glaring issues and a communist dictatorship, right, the biggest fear of a dictator is an upbringing, an uprising, the fact that someone will actually try to take them down, the fact that lots of people that are in China will actually uproar and take it down. So in order to keep public support in the country, to try to at least try to do it, you have to pull on the strings of like ethos and nationality, right? You have to divert the public attention to hate the enemy and not the government. And we can see it in the fact that China has been escalating its pseudo attempts and showing of power that it can actually attack Taiwan, but at some point it's just not going to be enough, especially because the pressure right now from the West is really, really big. There are more and more sanctions, but without actually clear backing up from Taiwan, which is for Taiwan, which is making China feel cornered, like it has to act, but with no actual repercussions. Third reason, the new sanctions of US and China, again, leaves it with little choice. Like, they feel like they need to assert dominance because in the current situation, they need to show the West that if the West doesn't play nice and starts to really limit its opportunity to economically grow, they have to show that in some sort of way it's not legitimate, right? And attacking Taiwan, showing, oh, okay, if you actually keep me out of the economic game, I can attack Taiwan, I actually have power, is one of the only ways China has to actually do it. Yes, first.
Status quo is that China still has something to lose and therefore does not attack Taiwan today.
Okay, even if NATO isn't Taiwan, I think that I really don't understand why it doesn't have anything to lose, right? Still, a lot of its economy is based on like US dollars and on the Western economy. Still, most of the economy there is dependent on the chain of production for other countries. Even if NATO or the West, sticks a finger inside China's eye, it doesn't really change the fact that China is still dependent on those countries to survive. There is still a huge incentive to play nice, to do what they have to do in order to just, be able to grow economically and do what they need to do. Okay, why NATO will definitely stop that? At the end of the day, the meaning of NATO is this. If someone invades the sovereignty, if someone attacks one of the countries, the whole NATO needs to actually stand behind it, right? And China knows that the US cannot afford to not do it. The minute that they do not attack China back, full force, right? Maybe even with nuclear weapons. The minute they don't do it, NATO falls apart. Because the minute that the US doesn't actually hold its promise to one of the actual member NATO country, that's the moment where NATO does not have a meaning anymore, where the different countries that are not the US, that are in NATO or considering to join NATO, know that they don't actually have backing. So China knows this. China knows that if they act upon Taiwan when it's a part of NATO, US will have to act, and they know that if the US will act, they will have no chance economically or just war-wise for all those reasons.
Okay, panel. This house believes that NATO should grant Taiwan membership. All of what happened in first house was trying to determine how likely is a third world war if we are granting Taiwan membership. They said it's really, really likely. They said it's not really likely. They didn't give us any constructive point on why specifically we should grant membership for Taiwan. No one thinks we need to grant Iran membership against Iraq. No one thinks we should grant Iraq against Iran. NATO is a Western alignment to protect each other. We are taking risk together in order to protect our alignment, our ideology, our ideological alignment. You have to prove me that Taiwan is part of this alignment, is part of the Western world. You cannot just assume this is so. Taiwan and China were the same fucking people like 100 years ago, okay? It's just a colonial leftover from the Cold War and Second World War separation that we, the West, created. Prove me that Taiwan is not just Chinese people in a different flag. Now, our opposition here did tell us that there is a lot of risk for war, which is true. But again, NATO is an alignment to take risk of war. Yes, this is the whole point of NATO. So if someone in government would have shown me that there is a valuable point to protect, NATO should do it. No one showed us any point except for second government told us a little bit that people are going to die. Again, this is happening in Africa, this is happening in the Middle East, this is happening everywhere around the world. This is not a reason to grant membership to any country. NATO is not a charity organization that helps everybody. It needs to help Western world and Western country that are in alignment ideologically with us. Now, my point is, and this is going to be a constructive point about why we shall not intervene in what's happening in China. My point is that the separation of Taiwan is a leftover of colonial ideology from the Cold War. Granting them NATO protection is an effort to write it in the stone forever. We have no reason to intervene in the first place. We created this separation. We did it in Africa, we did it in the Middle East, we did it in Taiwan, we did it in the East. Trying to protect it now is holding on a wrong ideology that we already reclaim. We don't like this ideology. We don't like to intervene. When we can not intervene, it's better. It's creating bad thing to intervene in countries that we don't understand, that have different culture than us. Trying to hold on it will increase the risk of war. Yes, and it will increase this risk of war for no fucking reason. We don't know. No one in government told us why we should increase the risk of this specific war. If they would have told us that this is what's going to keep the Western world alive, okay, maybe, but no one proved it, no one analyzed it, so there is no reason to risk this war. And this war, as my friends in opposition bench already told you, is very, very likely. Again, if this was Nazi Germany that is threatening the whole European Union, which didn't exist, but the whole country of Europe, I would understand, yes, let's take this risk. Sometimes we do want to take risks. This is why we have NATO. We do talk about letting Ukraine go into NATO because we find Ukraine as a strong ally for the West and we want to protect them from Russia. We didn't take this decision yet. We see what's happened. It's very likely it would be even worse with China, but we are discussing it because we have a reason to do it. Give me a single reason. They didn't do it. There is no reason to do it. Yes, second house, redeem yourself.
Okay, Taiwan is one of the sole producers of components crucial to advanced chips and technology, and it sells it exclusively to the West. The West superior economy.
Amazing! Creating chips is an important thing. This is not ideological. We do grant them protection from the American. It does not mean we need to let them be part of NATO. We do put a lot of effort to take all the production of chips from Taiwan to a less controversial area. This is not a reason to take the risk of declaring war on the fucking strongest empire in the world today. Yes? Purchasing power parity GDP. China is stronger and economically than USA from 2010. Check me on it in the internet. You don't want to start war with the strongest empire in the world just for creating chip when you have the alternative to just do the status quo and try to protect it while transferring all the factories for the West to more stable area, and that's it. And I really hope that I'm not the only crazy guy in the room that understands that we need to explain why we do and do not think Taiwan should be part of NATO. But I think what happened in this room is that we have just analysis of how likely is war without understanding if we want to take the risk or not, if we want to protect from this war or not. We have some utility that we get from Taiwan, from second house. We can easily, with my counter-prop, just have a better solution than making them part of NATO and risking World War III. And because we don't have any reason to grant membership for Taiwan, I call you to believe it's wrong to grant them membership. Thank you very much.
Now, What we essentially have in this debate is a game of chicken, and in the world that will be afterwards. We need to ask ourselves who will back up first and who has the trust. Right now what happens is China claims to say things that will happen if the USA will, and whatever NATO will indeed include Taiwan into those agreements. We think that what the NATO needs to do is take that claim and go a step forward in that game of chicken in order to exactly prevent the small escalations that OO talks about and OG talks about those smaller things of bombing of ships, of bombing of civilians and whatever it is, because right now China doesn't think that the USA and NATO will actually do something about it. We will show you why exactly that will change, and we will take that burden of proof that wasn't explained fully in OG. Let's get right into it. First of all, one point of rebuttal. We think that most cases of OO, we already showed you that are probably symmetrical on both sides of this house, but we also think that when we talk about China, that they tell us that it feels that it has to show it has power after the Taiwan NATO thing, through other means like supporting Ukraine and things like that. We think that first of all, considering China already has quite a lot of incentive to show it has as much power as it can and things like that, we think that it doesn't really change. But second, when they talk about the other countries in Asia and how they want to show that they have a big whatever, we think that that isn't really relevant, because the other countries in Asia and things in East Asia and things like that will still be scared of China exactly because of the reason that they do not have that agreement with NATO. We think that China doesn't lose all of those things when they agree with Taiwan. So we think that most of the reasons are symmetrical in this world, and if we don't see that escalation in Ukraine or things like that, we wouldn't see that later on. Let's get into the main clash here, which I'm just going to stay on it, which is about the chances of escalation. I will note, however, CO, when they talk about, oh, we don't have an ideological reason, we don't think that we need to show you an ideological reason to have Taiwan in NATO. We just need, this is a motion of this House believes. We just want to show that it is greater for the whole world, and that's exactly what we are doing. We think most of the case is really irrelevant. Let's talk about the chances of escalation, because what we get is something very interesting. What we get from OO, that it is likely that there will be a bigger war, or at least an escalation, because of like the empiric evidence that we have right now. When the West does something, the East does something in retaliation. They also talk about the nationalism and need to be seen as strong and things like that. Do know that most of those reasons are exactly things that happen right now. But on the reason of, oh, every step that the West does, the East should do something, we think that exactly because we take that lost stand of something that now the East can't do anything about it, we think that we exactly prevent those small escalations, those things of retaliation and things like that, and I will explain it very shortly. Now, what do we get from OG on that? We think that the main point that they show us, and the only relevant point to why NATO changes all that thing and the joining to NATO and things like that, is that they tell us, look, because the NATO has like Article 5 and things like that, and that is very important in order for the other NATO countries to trust that agreement. We don't really understand what that means. Does that mean that the countries that currently in Europe think that they are the same as Taiwan or things like that? We think that is very unlikely to be, and that is exactly why we take on that burden to also explain deeper what exactly they mean when they say those things. What we give you is because in order to have newer countries in NATO that actually trust the West, or even countries overall, not rather in NATO, in order to have economic or military agreements with the USA, with the Western powers and things like that, we think that in order to do that, we must have the trust from the West. We think that because of that reason, the West must take on that Article 5 agreement, and not because it just shows that in some kind of contract and things like that. We think that in order to exactly keep those things, and China knows that the US must do those things. We think that exactly for that reason, China will not take the chance in this situation. China will not do those small escalations, which also OG didn't answer, exactly because of that reason, and that is why they won't happen on our side, and do happen on their side when they do not join NATO. Yes, first.
We just win on sides of impact. Even if does were to be more likely, which they're not, the risk of an initiated escalation isn't worth the risk for the NATO itself as opposed to what China is willing to risk.
Okay, we think that if they talk about an all-out escalation of maybe even the East will go out against the Western in retaliation for that thing, we think that is extremely highly unlikely. In like the 0.0001%, we're willing to take that chance in order to prevent the smaller escalations and things like that. Why do we think that is very, very unlikely? Exactly because they are so much dependent on each other economically. That means that also OG's explanation to why there are no escalations or things like that, talking about sorry, I just want my timer back. When they talk about those economic sanctions, we think that those are unlikely, and we also give that because exactly those countries are dependent on each other so much economically. That means that China and the US, China and the NATO countries depend on each other for work, for technology, for everything that they have around them, whether it's oil or minerals and things like that. We think that because of that, an actual all-out escalation is really not something that can happen, but we also think that exactly because of that reason, we have no other option of stopping those small escalations from happening that happen right now, unless we actually take that step forward to prevent them completely. Because if now they do those small escalations, China knows that now NATO will interfere. NATO will do something, and they do not want to take that risk in any chance because it comes to an all-out war that will eventually do so much bad to both sides. For all those reasons, very proud to propose.
Okay, two main points were made in the first speaker in Makov. The destroying of any chance of peace between Taiwan and China in the far future, and helping the NATO completion. So when Taiwan will join NATO, it will be quite irreversible. They will join. They will send troops to NATO. NATO will have troops at Taiwan. They will be more integrated with the Western culture, and it will create more separation between Taiwan and China that until 100 years ago were one country. So what that will create is more separation between the two countries and destroying of any chance for peace in the future. A lot of countries in the past have been conflicted and then has been able to create peace, and also possible between Taiwan and China. But if we intervene more, as we've seen with other countries, it will create an irreversible effect that will annihilate any chance for peace in the future. And the second point that I want to elaborate on was that by including Taiwan in NATO, until now all the countries in NATO share close ideology and quite close geographical location. And when we take a country that is far away, speaks to a totally different language, has a different racial background, and it's very much different from the other countries, it will start thinking of, wait, we can also join this country, and we also can get this country to join, and so and so and so, which will hurt NATO because they will countries that risk their people in the military and get resources into NATO to protect countries that they don't share ideology with and they don't share geographical location with or interest. So what this will create is a breaking of the NATO alliance, which could in the future when NATO will really be needed for a conflict like in the scale of World War II, which they will be needed to prevent. They will not be there because they will break us.
China engaging in pointless small attacks in Taiwan and Ukraine would hurt their reputation at home and abroad by appearing clueless, arbitrary and cruel and causing significant damage to the trade relationship with peaceful nations.
Okay, so although there is attacks and there is some friction between Taiwan and China today and the countries that surround it, by joining Taiwan into NATO, it will create a much greater friction. Even the talks about joining Ukraine to NATO or Georgia to NATO, the talks about joining Georgia into NATO created an invasion from Russia into Georgia, just to deteriorate them from joining NATO. So if Taiwan will start the process into getting into NATO, and if they will get into NATO, not only that it will increase the risk, increase the friction in the area, but risk an invasion that is possible. Yes.
Taiwan is a peaceful democracy. China is a dictatorship that violates human rights. Obviously, we wouldn't want Taiwan to assimilate back into China, even if it was possible, which is really improbable.
A lot of countries in the past have been a horrible dictatorship, like Germany and other countries, and their government was replaced. And it's also possible in China, even not in the in our times, maybe in the next 15, 20 years to the future, and it really is a possibility that can be lost by joining into NATO. So we explained to why it can help the NATO alliance and why it can help any chance for peace between Taiwan and China, and it okay. So if there is a chance for peace and we lose it in the world that we will Taiwan will join to NATO, even if there will be a deterrence against a full-on invasion, there will still be a friction in the area, and any chance in the future for ending the conflict will be lost because of this. So we better take on the status quo and hope for a betterment in the future than taking a plausible chance for an invasion. Thank you.